Welcome to today's lecture by Professor Ilan Pappè, which is sponsored by the Department of History and the Social Justice Institute of Case Western Reserve University, and is part of a visit by Professor Pappè to Cleveland, sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Consortium on Middle East Studies, Cleveland State University, Kent State University, and interested citizens and civic groups. My name is Ken Ledford, and I'm the chair of the Department of History, and I'm here for purely decorative purposes to introduce Professor Pappè and then to recognize questioners afterwards when we begin that part. But I want particularly to thank Professors Tim Black and John Flores, as well as the administrator, Ms. Lisa Collins, who work with the Social Justice Institute for their sponsorship and efforts in arranging today's event. And also Professor Emeritus of Medicine, Doug Kerr, all of whom engaged in generous and tireless support to make today's lecture possible. And I would bring your attention to the fact that outside we have flyers for a Social Justice Institute event coming up, part of their research lunch series on Tuesday, October 9th, from 11:30 a.m. to 12:45 p.m., which is in the Social Justice Institute, A9. A13. The office is A9. The meeting room is A13 in Crawford Hall. And the topic will be presented by Professor Avidan Cover. Avi is here today. He's a faculty member at the School of Law and a research fellow at the SJI. And he will be giving a talk on his research on collective punishment in the occupied Palestine territory. Now, while Professor Pappè is speaking about a variety of subjects during his visit to Northeast Ohio, today he's speaking to us about history as a discipline. One of the characteristics that historians teach our students about history as a science, a craft, and a discipline is how the writing of the history of any given event, institution, or phenomenon might advance. The history of the recent past is often cast as a narrative of discovery, using documents, records, testimony, and other artifacts of the past to create a plausible tale that accounts for those data and tells a story, usually structured by chronology. But because history is a heuristic and interpretive discipline, the narrative changes over time. Newly discovered or newly declassified artifacts change the given narrative. New insights change the interpretations that change the narrative. And because history is a critical discipline, no meaning-building narrative, no sacred foundational tale is off limits for historians to question. And historical revision, the recasting of meaning-giving narratives, always provokes resistance from forces in every society, forces that benefit from a hegemonic master narrative. Professor Pappè is a member of a school of historians, the Israeli New Historians, who, with chronological and generational distance from the events of 1948 and the era that preceded it, began 30 years ago to re-examine the historical accounts of the founding era of the State of Israel. Given politics inside Israel, within the Middle East, and with echoes into Europe and the United States and around the world, that new history was and remains controversial. As is the case with all historical schools of thought, the Israeli new history is not now, nor has it ever been singular and monolithic. Historians are contentious intellectuals, and our understanding of the multiplicity of history advances with contention, even as all master narratives find themselves critiqued and sometimes eroded. Professor Pappè's talk to us today will illustrate, in its particular context, a process of the scientific creation of historical understanding that is helpful to us in the United States today, as we reflect upon hegemonic narratives that surround Confederate memorials erected half a century after the Civil War, as well as struggles over enfranchisement and disenfranchisement practices a century and a half after the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and a half century after the enactment of the Voting Rights Act. Professor Ilan Pappè was born in Haifa, Israel in 1954 and took his BA from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and his DPhil from the University of Oxford. From 1984 to 2006, he taught at the University of Haifa, and since 2007, he has been professor of history and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Pappè to speak to us today on the topic, History is Relevant, the Israeli New History and its Legacy.
No, it looked as if I had second thoughts about this talk and was going out, but it's the weird structure of the hall. So I'm still confident that I'm in the right place, talking about the right topic. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Thank you all for being here today. Let me start by some sort of a biographical note to get us into the topic. I usually don't use PowerPoint presentations. I find it a tool that limits one's imagination, and I'd rather talk directly to the audience. But if I had a PowerPoint presentation, the first picture, the first slide, which, if you can imagine, would be myself at the age of 12, holding these and waving the Israeli flag. By which I would have meant to tell you that I had a very ordinary Israeli upbringing, a very typical Israeli Jewish biography. Born to a Jewish family, going through the usual stages in the life of a young Israeli who was born in the 1950s, which meant serving in the Israeli army. I had the unfortunate luck to be also in a war, the 1973 war on the Golan Heights. And the first slide would say, in a way, what went wrong? How did this person who was educated within the Israeli system became a challenger of the dominant historical narrative of that state? The second slide would probably show me with a confused face. That's why I decided not to have a PowerPoint presentation. I had no idea how to do that. But you should have seen a person that looks bewildered or confused. In the early 1970s, a BA student at the Hebrew University who loved history. I was very bad in school in any other discipline, that is high school, but I was very good in history for some reason. So I chose history also as a BA student. I took Middle Eastern history and international relations in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And the bewilderment had to do with the fact that towards the third year of my undergraduate studies, I became more and more focused on the history of Israel and Palestine, and not just on the region itself. And in the third year, I became aware of a kind of a contradiction in the way that history was taught. There was, on the one hand, a sense that Palestine, throughout the centuries, was an empty place. And we hardly talked about anyone else in the modern history of Palestine, apart from the Jewish community there. And yet, when we arrived to the end of the BA and we talked about the events of 1948, we were told that the Palestinians left voluntarily in 1948, and that's how the Palestinian refugee problem was created. And I remember asking one of my professors, if these people left, who were they if the country was empty? His answer was something to do about students who are troublemakers and should know better and maybe should choose a different career. The third clip or slide would show me in a much happier face, a much more assured face, and this is when I started my PhD studies in Oxford in England in 1980. It became very clear to me when I finished my undergraduate studies as a historian that I would like very much to study the history of my own country. That makes sense. Secondly, that I would like to look at both sides of the argument, if I can. And one of my professors suggested that I should look at the British policy because both sides hated the British. And maybe that would give me a kind of a more objective perspective on the history of the country. So I knew I had to go to Britain and to look at British policy towards Palestine. Then, as those of you who are historians know, you cannot study for a PhD the whole history of a country. You have to choose a person or a pivotal moment or a formative event. And it was only natural that I chose 1948, a year that in the Zionist narrative is a miraculous year, when 2,000 years of Jewish exile come to an end, a very happy year. And for the Palestinians, the most catastrophic year, disastrous year in their history. And this kind of contradiction between the two framing of the year meant that 48 was a very good topic for historical research, and I decided to study the British policy towards the 1948 events. That was the topic of my PhD students. And when I was accepted to the University of Oxford, I had a choice of supervisors, and I said to myself, I need to do it differently than most Israeli PhD students, and I have to choose an Arab supervisor. I actually wanted a Palestinian supervisor, but there wasn't anyone in Britain at the time. So the closest I could do was to work with the famous Orientalist Albert Hourani, who was a Lebanese and not a Palestinian, but who testified on behalf of the Palestinians in the Anglo-American Committee of 1948. Albert Hourani, when he first met me, warned me. He said, you have a chance, you have an exit point here. Are you sure you want to work on 1948? And I said, yes. Why? He said, well, it will change your life. And I had no idea what he was talking about. Many years later, I understood what he meant, but that was too late. I couldn't get out of it. At the time that I decided to work on 1948, there was another group of Israeli historians who also, probably for similar reasons, thought that 1948 was a good topic for a PhD. One of the reasons all of us decided to look at 1948, apart from the reasons I've mentioned, was very practical. Under the secrecy laws of Great Britain, and to a certain extent of Israel and the United Nations, documents are declassified after 30 years. So the documents pertaining to 1948 were released in 1978. And I came to Oxford in 1980. So it made sense to go and look at the documents at which very few historians had researched before us. But something very interesting happened. There was quite a large group of Israeli historians who went to the British archives, to the Israeli archives, the American archives, the United Nations archives in the early 1980s. But only a very small number of them came out with a new insight about their own country's history. The vast majority of them said to themselves and to others, we haven't found anything in the documents which was new to us. And that was very surprising to me, because for me and for 3 or other 4 historians, which, as was mentioned, we were called later the new historians, what we saw in the documents totally changed our historical perspective on the past in general and on 1948 in particular. So why did the others not see what we saw? This question led me to venture into the area of historiography, of the philosophy of history, to question of subjectivity and objectivity in history. And it became clear to me that what influences the story you tell eventually as a professional historian is not just what you find in the documents. They're not just the facts. They have a lot to do with your moral position, your ideological orientation, the time in which you write, and your personality. They are all factors that influence the story you finally tell. In particular, I found out that this was important for how you treat a document in the archive. Do you treat the document as a reflection of the truth? Or is the document yet another interpretation of the truth? Do you trust the interpretation of an Israeli soldier in 1948? And do you trust an interpretation of Israeli soldier in 2018? If you have some doubts about their reports in 2018, you should have the same doubts about their reports in 1948. This is not a direct route to the truth. It's just another obstacle on the way to the truth. And apparently what happened was that a small group of Israeli historians did not only read in the document something that they didn't know about, for reasons that had to do with the contemporary reality in which they lived, suspected that what they read in the Israeli documents was not the truth, and deconstructed the documents in order to find out what they thought was the true story about Palestine. I will give you one example to show you how it works. If you go to the documents, you can see that the Israeli army orders the troops in 1948 to occupy the enemy bases, to destroy them, and to expel the enemy outside of the country. Now, if you are a bit open-minded, and you think in the 1980s about the occupation of the West Bank, if you think about the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, then you say, wait a minute, what is this base? Is it a military bunker with outposts, with regular soldiers, armed soldiers, or is it a village? It turns out it's a village, and that the enemy troops are babies, women, old men, and some soldiers. But they are all together the enemy. And therefore, destroying the enemy base in the document, if you report verbatim the document, you could think that this was a conventional war in 1948. But if you are familiar with the reality in your own time, you understand that the base is a village or a neighborhood in a city. And therefore, the destruction of the base is the demolition of a village. And the killing of the enemy could be a massacre of civilians. That's why Israelis treated the Dahaya neighborhood in Beirut as an enemy base, but it's a civilian neighborhood. They treat the city of Gaza as a military base, but it's a civic space. And they treated the city of Jenin in 2002 as a military base. So it was very clear to me that the historians all went to the archives in the same door, but we went out in different doors. And the exit doors we chose had a lot to do with our political orientation, our moral understanding, and our willingness to challenge the hegemonic narrative which educated us until the point we met new evidence. Because in Israel, the narrative that you coexist with is a very powerful narrative. And it really accompanies you from the kindergarten through your life. History is very important to the Zionist movement, which was, like so many other movements in the world, a settler colonialist movement. And for settler colonialists, that is, people who come from abroad to another country, it's very important to have a clear historical story that explains to themselves and to others what are they doing in someone else's homeland. And that's why we, as Israeli Jews, we get a very clear notion of the narrative. And we live with it very closely. And I think one of the obstacles for people in archives who can see, who have the option of seeing evidence that contradicts this narrative, one of the obstacles is that leaving the narrative, challenging the narrative, could be deemed as an act of treason. In fact, I was called by my rivals in Israel as a traitor for not adopting the Zionist narrative about the events of 1948 and about the history of Palestine in general. So the challenge is so big, in fact, that, to be honest with you, I think you are in the presence of the new historians movement in this room. You didn't understand my English humor. I'm the only new historian left. That's what I meant. It was a movement, and I'm the only new historian. So if you want to get rid of the new history of Israel, you just have to get rid of me. And the reason is that some of my colleagues could not withstand the accusation of treason. Did not expect, I think, the kind of response they would get for what they thought was the truth, but what their peers thought was an act of defiance, subversiveness, and treason. So I think that that's very important to understand, not only in the context of Israel and Palestine. Any historian who would challenge their national narratives, their hegemonic narratives, should not expect any gratitude from the society, especially not at times of conflict, where historical narratives are as important as ammunition as is the military capacity of both sides. So those who were part of the new history challenged the Israeli narrative on several points. I will mention a few of them on 1948. The challenge itself appeared as books, as articles, as interviews in the newspapers, in television, on radio. In fact, it was quite important for many Israelis, the debate on the 48 events, especially in the 1990s. In one of my books, I describe a debate between the new and old historians at the University of Tel Aviv, which coincided with the semi-final of the soccer world competition that actually was here in the United States. And Israelis love soccer. They love soccer. And for Israelis to miss a semi-final is quite unheard of. And therefore, the organizers for the debate chose a very small room, even smaller than this one. They didn't think many people would show a debate about the history of 48. And lo and behold, 700 people came. And in the last minute, we had to find the largest hall possible in the University of Tel Aviv. People found it very interesting in the 1990s. You won't find 7 people today who would come to a debate about 48 in Israel. That's how Israel has changed within 20 years. It's amazing. But in the 1990s, probably also because of the Oslo Accord, which today we mentioned 25 years to the Oslo Accord, and the sense that maybe there is a chance for peace with the Palestinians, I think that also created this idea that maybe we should revisit some of the history, and so on. I think that also contributed to the interest in the debate. So for a while, this was a very lively debate. I will talk in a minute how it died and how it disappeared. But I would say that between 1990 to 2000, for 10 years, the debate about the past was a very prominent part of the Israeli culture, not only in the academia, also among playwrights, in the theater, in films, among journalists and educators, among artists. It was quite an attractive topic for many people who were producing knowledge, whether it was an academic knowledge or cultural knowledge or any kind of knowledge. At the heart of it was our work about 48. The first, and I think not so important point we made, it was important for Israelis, but I think in hindsight it was not the most important point. But the first point we did, we grew up on the myth that in 1948 Israel was a David that defeated an Arab Goliath. There is an atlas on the Arab-Israeli conflict, which was prepared by one of Britain's greatest historians who died just a year ago, Sir Martin Gilbert. It's called the Atlas of the History of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. And if you want to understand the Israeli narrative, you have to look at the map that this atlas has on the 1948 war. You can see thick, huge arrows coming from the Arab world into Palestine, and you need a very good eyesight to detect the Israeli arrow that comes to meet them. You understand what the image conveys, right? So we did something very simple. We counted troops, which we're not supposed to do, apparently, because we found out that there were more Israeli soldiers than Arab soldiers in the 48 war. So it was not exactly David and Goliath. Maybe there were two Davids, semi-Davids, semi-Goliaths, I don't know, whatever you want. But it was not a David and Goliath. Not only that, we found out that the Israeli army was far better equipped in terms of arms, far better trained, that the Egyptian army, for instance, was made of half of the Egyptian contingent that was sent into Palestine were prisoners, Muslim Brotherhood prisoners, whom the Egyptian government gladly sent to the campaign, hoping that they gave them a one-way ticket to Palestine. The most efficient Arab army, the Arab Legion of Transjordan, it was called then, Jordan of today, which had military officers running it, British military officers running it. That army was very limited in its operation in 1948 because Jordan and Israel had an agreement that in return for annexing the West Bank to Jordan, the Jordanian army would have a limited role in the 48 war. And the Lebanese and Syrian army were not really a very powerful or impressive as military rule. But I don't want to underestimate the fact that there was a war between Israel and contingents from the neighboring Arab states who entered Palestine on the 15th of May 1948, the day that the British mandate or rule over Palestine ended. And this was a war. This was a proper war. People were killed on both sides. Well, one should say that. I think the most important point we made, or the most important myth we debunked, which is far more important than David and Goliath, although, as you can understand, it also is important. But the most important myth we debunked, which really got us into trouble, and I think was the main reason why few of us could not withstand the pressure, was about how the Palestinians became refugees in 1948. That was the most important issue. There were two kind of versions to the Israeli narrative about 48. There was kind of the official narrative that you could have found, which was a bit ridiculous. I think maybe some Israelis even felt it was ridiculous, which said that the Palestinians left voluntarily because the Arab leaders, the leaders of the neighboring Arab states, and the leaders of the Palestinians told them to leave and to make way for the invading Arab armies with a promise to come back. This is what was the official narrative. Then there was a more sophisticated narrative that said, well, some people might have been expelled, but it all started in May, on the 15th of May 1948, when the Arab armies invaded Palestine. And when the Arab armies invaded Palestine, there was a war, and people in a war become refugees. That happens all over the world. So it was the war that was responsible for the making of the Palestinian refugee problem. Now, to our great surprise, for those of us who had been open-minded enough, we saw that both narratives did not fit what we found in the archives. What we found in the archives is that from the mid-1930s, and definitely immediately after the Second World War, the Zionist political and military leadership contemplated and planned mass expulsion of Palestinians in order to create what they thought would be a Jewish democratic state. They wanted as much of Palestine as possible, with as few Palestinians in it as possible. Their main problem in 1947, 1948, when the British rule came to an end, was that the Jews in Palestine were only 1/3 of the population. And even when the United Nations took over the issue of Palestine from Britain and suggested to partition Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state in November 1947, the demographics were such that even in the Jewish state that was offered by the United Nations, the Jews were still not the majority, because there were too few Jews in Palestine in 47, 48. And the solution, definitely after the Second World War, in the eyes of the leading Zionist politicians and military commanders, was very clear. What I called in my book of 2007, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. The decision to expel massively the Palestinians from any area that would become the Jewish state eventually was taken in March, in the beginning of March 1948. That is 2 months before the Arab armies entered Palestine. And we wrote a story that most Israelis found very disturbing. We said, actually, the Arab armies entered Palestine because the Zionist movement was already expelling Palestinians for 2 months. And these Palestinian refugees began to reach the Arab capitals. And there was a pressure by Arab public opinion on the Arab governments to do something, especially after the Deir Yassin massacre on the 9th of April 1948, which was broadcast all over the Arab world. It was not the only massacre. When you expel people, there are always massacres. People don't like to be expelled. And when they refuse, you shoot them. But the most known massacre in those days was the massacre of a small village near Jerusalem, Deir Yassin. And that in particular put pressure on the Arab governments, who, by the way, didn't want to send one soldier into Palestine. The Egyptian parliament decided on the 13th of May, 2 days before the 15th of May, to send an army into the Sinai Peninsula and from there into Palestine. And as I said, they decided to send mostly the prisoners from the Muqattam camp where the Muslim Brotherhood were interned. So we described a sequence of events by which we said, actually, the Palestinians did not become refugees because of the war. They became refugees because the Zionist movement planned their massive expulsion, what I called the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity. Ethnic cleansing is not justified by anyone in any circumstances. You cannot massively expel people just because of who they are. And it was very systematically planned. In March 48, the army adopted something called Plan D, or Plan Daled. And according to that plan, Palestine was divided into areas, and each brigade of the a Jewish Zionist army, later became the Israeli army, had a list of villages to occupy and to destroy and to expel. The major problem for the Zionist movement was the urban space in Palestine. There were tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in 11 towns. The most important of them were Jaffa and Haifa. And it's important to remember that Jaffa and Haifa were de-Arabized in April 1948, not after the Arab armies entered Palestine, but before the Arab armies entered Palestine. These are not small details. They are very important. The sequence is very important here, because the Arab world was blamed that in 1948 it wanted to destroy the Jewish state. Nobody tells the story the way we told it. I mean, there were Palestinian historians who were trying to tell the story in such a way, but nobody listened to them. We kosherized, if you want, the Palestinian narrative. You needed a Jew to do the job, which irritated a lot of my Palestinian friends, and I understand it, but I told them there was no other way of doing it. They would not listen to you in America if you are a Palestinian historian, but they would listen to you if you are an Israeli Jewish historian, which they did, which is true. So my hometown Haifa had 75,000 Palestinians living in it. Within 2 days, 2,000 were left. 3,000 Palestinians were left out of 45,000 in the city of Jaffa. They were expelled within 10 hours. What is incredible, we found out that actually we didn't even need the archives for that. We needed the archives for understanding the planning of the ethnic cleansing. But we did not need the archives to know what happened. We actually found out that the New York Times had a correspondent, I think you call it today, was embedded with the Jewish forces, had some other newspapers, and they wrote home reports, very accurate reports, of what was going on. But the editor of the New York Times decided to put it on page 5 or page 6, and I think it just escaped the attention of people. The Red Cross was really disturbed by what was going on, and the emissaries of the Red Cross wrote very powerful description of what happened. But the Red Cross headquarters in Geneva said, 3 years after the Holocaust, we don't want to blame the Jews of mass murder, expulsion, rape, and poisoning. There was only one instance in which the Red Cross decided to brave this self-censorship that it imposed on itself. The Israeli troops poisoned the water of Acre, in order to make the city surrender. And the Red Cross reported this to the United Nations. One of the reasons that it got known was that there were still some British doctors working in the hospital in Acre who themselves got the typhus out of this poisoning act. Israel apologized and so on, but and this, by the way, again, happened before the 15th of May. It's very interesting. In the 1990s, an Israeli reporter interviewed the 2 Israeli troops, soldiers, who injected the typhus into the water. I don't know if anybody of you have been in Acre. Acre's water supply comes from an aqueduct, a Roman aqueduct, which is still there. It was the main supply. So the water goes into the old city in the open, so you can easily poison it. And 2 soldiers, apparently, who felt very bad about it many, many years later, after I wrote it in my book, gave an interview to Yediot Achronot, which is an Israeli daily, and admitted that they were the ones who put the poison. And I think that was, for me, a moment of epiphany, only in the sense that it didn't shock anyone in Israel. I mean, nobody denied it, nobody said anything about it. Said, okay, so you poisoned some people, and so what? That also explained to me this sense of commitment that I felt when I wrote my books on 48, and why my colleagues didn't have a similar sense of commitment. Namely, they didn't think there was something terribly wrong with poisoning the water of a city. For me, I don't know how you feel about it, but for me it's a horrific crime. It's a horrible thing to do, even in war. In war, you don't poison people's houses. You don't poison. This is a war crime. People who do this usually sit all their life in jail. So our understanding was that Palestinians became refugees because the Israelis wanted to create a Jewish democratic state. In other words, they wanted to come to the first elections in Israel with the assurance that there is a Jewish majority so that the democracy would be Jewish. And I think that explains the massive expulsion of the Palestinians. Within 9 months, 500 villages, half of Palestine villages, were destroyed, wiped out, and on the ruins of these villages, Israel planted forests. They imported 10,000 pine trees from Europe to cover up some of the ruins. They also thought that the landscape was too Arab, so they wanted a European landscape. The pine trees in most places, by the way, are very ill. They don't fit the climate. In other places, they built Jewish settlement on the ruins of the Palestinian villages, quite often using the same name, the Arabic name, and giving it a Hebrew name to show that this is not an occupation of a village, it's a redemption of the village. Namely, we're going back to a village that was ours 2,000 years ago, but happened to be Arab for 2,000 years. So Safuria becomes Tzipori. Yajur becomes Yagur, right? Lubia becomes Lavi. Almost every kibbutz and settlement you can see in pre-67 Israel is built on the ruins of a Palestinian village. The third myth we debunked, again, I think was less important than the second one, was that the myth was that after the war, Israel stretched its hand for peace and there was no one to reciprocate it. We actually found out that there was quite a willingness in the Arab world and among the Palestinians to renegotiate the reconciliation and peace, and it was actually the Israeli government that was intransigent and felt, quite normally one should say, that given the achievements they have gained in the 48, there was no reason for negotiation, because any negotiation would involve compromising or giving up territory or giving up or of being forced to allow the people to return to their homes. So Israel had no incentive whatsoever to go into a proper peace negotiations. But I think that was less important. I think what really was important was that we talked about the way the Palestinians became refugees. Interesting things happened afterwards in Israel. Other historians and sociologists or people who dealt with knowledge felt that if we were able to ask these brave questions about 48, maybe there are other chapters that have to be re-examined. So, for example, academics who were from an Arab Jewish origin, namely their parents or they themselves came from Arab countries or Muslim countries, revisited the way the young state has treated what is called the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews of Iraq, the Jews of Morocco, the Jews of Syria. And they discovered the discrimination, and mainly I think what they discovered in the archives was that the greatest fear among the Jewish leaders of the young state of Israel was that they are injecting Arabs into the Jewish state again, be it Jewish Arabs, it didn't matter. So they found the whole project of de-Arabization De-Arabization meant that you have to convince these people to change their Arabic names to Hebrew names, to try and get rid of the Arabic accent, and to also accept that they have to prove themselves that they're not Arabs. And the only way you can prove yourself that you're not Arab is become racist towards Arabs. So this de-Arabization was a very powerful project, accompanied by academics who believed in the theory of modernization and thought that this would be for the benefit of these Jews who came from Arab countries. So that was also part of the new history. No less important was the new history that dealt with the manipulation of the Holocaust memory in Israel. Very sensitive issue. The fact that Israel treated very badly the survivors of the Holocaust. It preferred much more the victims, the dead victims of the Holocaust, in order to gain political capital on this issue. There was an attempt to say that there has to be much more universal memory coming out of the Holocaust rather than a Zionist one. So this was, and I don't have time to include all the chapters of the new history. I just want to say that it was not just about 1948. The last chapter became even more incisive, I think, and in many ways maybe it was kind of shooting us ourselves in the foot, because it really killed the new history. And that's when several of us decided also to re-examine the narrative that said that Zionism is nationalism. And we decided to examine the possibility that Zionism was colonialism, and even a settler colonialist movement. And we used the paradigm of colonialism and settler colonialism. So we were not just talking about a policy in 1948 or in the 1950s. We were talking about the very idea of the state, the very ideology of the state, and we question its validity. And I think that was one step too much for the Israeli academia, political and cultural establishment. And together with the fact that we started this project with the outbreak of the second intifada, the second uprising in the occupied territories that also spilled over into Israel itself, the country, the society was in no mood anymore to hear criticism of the past, definitely not criticism of the very ideological nature of the state. And quite a few of the new historians retracted. Some even published very embarrassing mea culpa, kind of I'm sorry kind of articles, which were quite pathetic. And others left. And therefore, I think you will find very little impact of the new history on the Israeli educational system, on the media, on the discourse. In fact, the whole Israeli political system moved to the right after 2000. And moving to the right meant also that you are not at all encouraged to look critically either at the present or at the past. In fact, in 2010, the Israeli Knesset passed a law which is called the Nakba law, which says that you are not allowed to frame the 1948 events as a Nakba, as a disaster. Unbelievable. They passed a law which should tell us how we should frame an event in the past. The reason is that it was very clear to the Israeli authority that they might be able to silence the Jewish voices who wrote critically about the past, but they cannot prevent the Palestinian citizens in Israel from looking at their own history and talking about the Nakba, or even as they say in Arabic, al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing ethnic cleansing. And I will end and open it up for you by saying something which I think is very important to understand. The late Edward Said said, and I think there was a very poignant idea that he had. He said, if in 1948 the ethnic cleansing of Palestine would have stopped, if it would be one event, one-off event, as terrible as it was, it would have been possible to build a new kind of reality in the relationship between Jews and Arabs. But he said it didn't stop in 1948. Between 1948 and 1967, Israel expelled 36 villages in order to downsize the number of Palestinians within the Jewish state. When Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, it expelled 300,000 Palestinians. 3 refugee camps near Jericho were emptied. The Muslim quarter in Jerusalem, near the Wailing Wall, was emptied. Since 1967 until today, another 250,000 Palestinians were expelled in various means from the West Bank. And the expulsion, the ethnic cleansing, continues as we speak. Sometimes it's just 1 Palestinian a day, sometimes it's more. But the main issue is that the Israeli notion of democracy is totally connected to demography. Namely, you cannot have a proper democracy unless you have a clear Jewish majority. And all the means are justified to get this majority. Massacre, ethnic cleansing, inducing people to leave, not allowing them to return. It's all part of the same methodology to sustain a democracy on the basis of racist demography. What is surprising is, of course, that the world tolerates it and calls Israel the only democracy in the Middle East. And the big question is, do we have the power, the will, and the commitment to change it from within, to change it from without, by boycotting, divestment, and sanction of Israel? Can we help Israelis and Palestinians to get to a place where they could live as equal citizens in a democracy, which is a flawed political system, but it's the best political system we can have? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Pappè has asked me to simply recognize questioners. We have a microphone, so please wait to pose your question after the microphone has been given to you. And I think since Professor Pappè is a guest here, let me ask each questioner to identify yourself, just so that you know who Professor Pappè is, and this way there can be a symmetry. So please begin. Professor Moore.
Thank you very much, Ilan. So during your talk, one of the things that really struck me is that I'm from the American South. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and right now in the United States, we're having a similar struggle over memory and history, right? So you have a Civil War battlefield, Confederate memorials in American cities in the South being torn down, others defend them. And I couldn't help but draw the parallel, right? And what I want to ask you is a very broad question, but I'm interested to get your thought, which is that when you're talking about history, you're also talking about memory. And you're talking about memory that's connected to forms of justice or quests for justice. And I think the struggle over these monuments in the American South can be framed that way too. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship between memory and justice? Because in the one sense, the people that died or suffered at the hands of great tragedies in the past can never have justice just because we memorize them or we memorialize them. But yet, as human beings, we still connect the two. We must bring memory to some sort of way of bringing justice. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that in the case of Israel. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I think I kind of referred to it, but I will extend on this because I think it's an important issue. I think memory becomes connected to, not just to justice, I would say also to cultural resistance, for instance, when it resonates with the present. I think it's very difficult to create a movement for justice where the injustice itself has totally been eradicated or disappeared. If African Americans in this country would have thought that the injustice of the time of slavery was gone in 2018, it would have been very difficult to connect the issue of slavery with the issue of discrimination against African Americans today. But because the discrimination continues, the memory of the slavery is so powerful. And not because people remember. It's not that people remember being slaves. But it's because this memory is part of an ongoing reality. In the case of Israel and Palestine, because Zionism is a settler colonialist movement, namely, it's a project that has not been completed. For settlers who come from Europe to create a new homeland, which they believe, and they have all the right to believe, was theirs 2,000 years ago, the fact that someone else is present on the land is a huge problem. And therefore, the way to try and get rid of the indigenous population is not an event. It's not an event. It's a structure. It's a structure. It's part of your way of thinking, your way of life, because life is not complete because they are still there. The present are still there. And therefore, I think justice and memory, in the case of the Palestinians, is so well connected because they can see that structure. They can see the connection between the massacre of Deir Yassin and the massacre of Gaza. They can see the connection between the destruction a few days ago of the village of Hiran and the destruction of the village of Safaria in 48. They don't have to remember the destruction of the village. They just have to read about it. And there you see something very interesting, which I know happened here as well. Oral history projects, which is now also an academic discipline. Oral history projects for young Palestinians in the Galilee, for instance, are part of their cultural resistance. It's not just a matter of justice, it's also a matter of the struggle for justice. So they try and go to the university and write a master thesis or a doctoral thesis, which they believe is part of their struggle for justice. And then the university establishment recognizes it as a political dissertation and says, no, you have to be academics, so don't write about your own history. This is the reason I created in 2007 in Exeter a Center for Palestine Studies. I wanted the Palestinians and Israelis who want to write about this issue with the commitment for justice to have a space, a safe space to write academic dissertations which they rightly should consider as part of the struggle for justice, not just a way for a promotion or an academic career. And I think we should not be afraid as teachers, as professors, as heads of universities to promote this kind of engagement of young people who write about the past with the injustices of the present.
Over here.
Okay, I don't need the mic, but
Please identify yourself so we all know. Thank you.
Michael Greenberg, so we'll go in the biochemistry department. It seems like the U.S.
Please use the microphone so it can be recorded on the videotape. Thank you.
It seems that Israeli history is almost a microcosm in broad analogy to U.S. history. I mean, there was genocide here. It's like a slow genocide in Israel. There's an ongoing civil rights movement in Israel now for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I was just wondering, the arc of history. We have historians, new historians here. I've been thinking of Howard Zinn, which I know he's even taught in the school, the people's history of. My kids have learned in high school. So, how much time is needed for that? I can even say I've mentioned this before, but when you have loss of historical memory, for instance, we have a very racist sign of a Native American for our baseball team here in Cleveland with a racist caricature. But, and there are protest movements, but by and large, it's not really changed. I mean, somewhat this year, but, there's not much outcry. So, is Israel waiting for the time they can name a Israeli soccer team as and have a Palestinian sheikh mascot? I mean, was that I know it's facetious, but is that the fading of historical memory, and is that the end game for the settler colonial movement?
It's very important to talk about the end game of settler colonial projects but I think we have to realize that the people who are holding the helm, the people who are the leaders, if you want, the people who make the decisions about the peace and war, about education, do not think, I think, in those terms of an end game. I think they are motivated by an end game, which they sometimes don't even bother to understand, but I think they have something else in mind. And I think there was one Israeli prime minister who articulated the best. His name was Yitzhak Shamir. And he said, and I think that gives you an idea where my answer goes to. He said that the best strategy for Israel is keeping the status quo. That's a strategy. He said, what we need as Israelis to do is make sure that nothing changes. Because as it is, it's okay. It's fine. Yes, we have rockets. I would say, if he were alive today, he would say, we have rockets from Gaza fired into Israel. You have insecurity in some areas of the settlements in the West Bank. You have a threat from Hezbollah in the north, maybe a threat from Iran, and so on. But this, he said, is life for Israelis, and they're used to it. It's a militarized society, so people go quite gladly, most of them, to the army. And they don't think that life can be different or even should be different. So I'm less worried about the end game. I'm really worried that the kind of situation that we want to change, which gives 6 million Jews privileges that the 6 million Palestinians who live between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean don't have, that this is good enough. I think it won't work, by the way, but I don't know what would be the human price for people to realize that it doesn't work. How many Palestinians would die and how many Israelis would die, because this is the strategic way of thinking. I don't think Israeli politicians or generals think they can get rid of all the Palestinians from all historical Palestine. I never heard one of them talk like this. No, they talk about something else. They talk about policing the Palestinians by being able to control them, to manipulate them. I can give you one example. The Israeli Minister of Transport, a guy called Israel Katz, was in Brussels a few days after a terrorist attack. And he appeared on the Belgian television. And he said, you have a problem in Belgium, he said, with at least 100 or 200 people who are terrorists. And you should consult us, because we have 1.5 million terrorists. That's the problem. That's the issue. It's the issue that the indigenous native population is a security problem. It's the problem that the rights of the Palestinian citizens or inhabitants of the West Bank or the Gaza Strip is an issue for the security services and not for the state that should, or the state agencies and outfits that should deal with citizens.
Yes, over here. Wait for the microphone if you would, please.
Yeah.
We can hear you in the room, but it's to capture it for the video.
Right.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Rowe. I'm a student of economics at Case Western, and I would like to ask, why do you think the status quo cannot go on? Looking from now, it seems like Israel is really in one of the best positions it's ever been in. Hamas has not been successful at all. The West Bank is under control. Hezbollah is sending all its fighters to die in Syria, and the BDS movement does not look to be is looking like just as much a failure as it's always been. So why do you think the status quo is not tenable? And I would also mention that Israel also has better relations with the Sunni Arab countries surrounding it than it ever has in the past.
Thank you. A good question. I'll tell you why I think it's not going to work. First of all, because I'm an historian, and for me, success of few years, even 70 years, is not a formula or a guarantee for success. You know, the Soviet Union was there for 70 years. The Crusaders were for 120 years. History can come back at you very quickly. I'll give you an example. I was in South Africa, and I remember talking to some of the leaders of the ANC, and they told me that in 1988, they got a note from Nelson Mandela in Robben Island telling them that apartheid is about to fall. And they said, the poor man, you know, so many years in the island, not surprising that he has these weird notions. And then they realized what he meant. The Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War came to an end. The United States, that refused to join this regime of sanctions against South Africa, decided to join the regime sanctions, and the whole thing changed. An economic crisis in this country takes America out of the fold in the Middle East and Palestine. Israel without the United States is not the same Israel, believe me. The new friends that Israel has, the prince in Saudi Arabia, General Sisi in Egypt, to say that these are regimes with longevity, I think would be given, if someone says it, he doesn't know the Middle East. I mean, the way Israelis tell themselves that they are secure is based on conjunctions that, yes, or constellations rather, that you're right, today work for them, but they can easily change. Believe me, they can easily change much quicker than we think. That's the second reason. And the third reason I'm convinced the status quo is not going to remain is that with all the Israeli military might, 250 nuclear weapons, the cutting edge military technology is useless in front of 6 million Palestinians who want their freedom and liberation. They can't use these weapons. You can't throw a nuclear bomb on Gaza because you will kill everyone in Tel Aviv. They come to the conclusion that their military capacity to do what they do is not enough. So I think that even deep down, some of them know that they have a problem. Unfortunately, some of the right-wing generals say, you're right, so we have to get rid of the Palestinians so that we won't face that kind of confrontation. But the more liberal generals, and we have liberal generals, say openly, the army will not, they say it openly, they said if there is a third uprising that includes the Palestinians in Israel, the army doesn't have military solution for that. So I think this is a very precarious scenario for a state that wants to promise security for its own people. Finally, I want to say to you, I'm also an activist. And if I lived in the United States and I would thought that the status quo in Cleveland, Ohio is unjust, I would fight from early in the morning until the early morning the next day to change that status quo. Anyway.
In the back. Thank you for your patience.
Ali Filali from the pathology department. Yes, you a very good talk. You just questioned the recent history of the state of Israel, so since 1948. But other historians question even the history of the Jewish people. Is it a nation or is it a religion, as Shlomo said? So what's your opinion on this? Thank you.
It reminds me, I was able, the last thing I did the last meeting I had with the late Edward Said, I introduced him to the book of Shlomo Zand, who was my friend at the time. The book was not written yet, but I shared with Said the concept of the book. For those of you who don't know, Shlomo Zant is an Israeli historian who wrote a book called The Invention of the Jewish People, in which he claims two things. One is that, contrary to the common Israeli narrative, most of the Jews were not expelled by the Romans 2,000 years ago, only the elite. So therefore, in a way, the Palestinians are the people who were the Jews of Palestine during the time of Christ. That's one argument. The second argument was that it's quite possible that the Jews who became the Jews of Europe came out of the Khazars, who converted to Judaism, a notion that already was developed by an English journalist by the name of Arthur Koestler in his book, The 13th Tribe. So I shared this with Edward Said, and he said, do me a favor. That's the last thing we Palestinians need. Now Palestinians would say, they are an invented people, everything is okay. They would recognize it and they would leave us alone. He said to me, concentrate on 48. It's important. It's important to say what the Jews did to Palestinians rather than who the Jews are. Let me most seriously say to you, he's a friend of mine and I think he did a very good job. It's a matter what interests you in life, you know. I think people are entitled to develop a narrative of who they are, really. The contemporary Greeks have the right to say that they are the descendants of the ancient Greeks. I don't think they are, but they have the right to do it. I'm not saying that this is how I start a lecture in Athens. I don't. But I can do it here. It's 3,000 miles away from Athens. I also don't start a lecture in Rome by saying the Italians, the contemporary Italians, are not the descendants of the ancient Romans. They are entitled to think that way. There are Lebanese who believe that they are descendants of the Phoenicians, and there are Swedes who believe that they are descendants of the Vikings. I don't care. You can choose whoever you like as your forefathers 2,000 years ago. I have no problem with that. My problem is, what do you do in the name of that narrative? If in the name of that narrative you destroy another people, the narrative is problematic, not because it's valid or invalid. So I don't deal with this, I must tell you. I really don't deal with this. I have my own views, but I don't think they're really important. I really think that we are, in our daily life, are subjects of narrative, and we create narratives, because that's how you can survive. It really matters what you do with them, not whether they are correct or not correct. Thank you. Yeah.
Right here on the corner.
Thank you so much for your remarks. My name is Akshay Singh. I'm an alum of the university. My question is about essentially, one idea has been to organize through BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, and I think there's a far way to go to change the orientation of the U.S. state. And for me, I question essentially if it isolates parallel movements and doesn't allow us to recognize here in the States the work of, academics like yourself, B'Tselem, the conscientious objectors of the IDF, the Hadash, and the Joint List. Are we, is there a way that we should be thinking about how to connect to anti-occupation sentiments? I mean, we've talked about a case. I know Professor Moore said Haaretz has much more critical opinions of the occupation than anything you'll read in the U.S. How do we essentially, keep working in parallel without, the idea of, a lot of times it sounds like for kind of early people in BDS, just like, let's not discuss what even takes place in Israel. We'll just work on the U.S. state.
Thank you. For me, the premise is whether you think that there is a chance for a change from within Israel in the near future. That's one question you should ask yourself. My answer is no. The second question I ask myself is the situation going to get worse for the Palestinians? My answer is yes. So the third question is, do I rely on the possibility of change from within, or do I go to the outside world and ask it to help me to redress the imbalance of power on the ground? And the answer is yes. And that's why I joined the BDS movement, that's why I believe in it. And I think there is no contradiction between putting pressure from the outside and empowering the people in the inside. And we're talking here about the inside Jewish society or the Palestinians inside Israel's struggle for liberation and peace. I don't see the contradiction. I think most of them also don't see the contradiction. So I don't think I would worry about that. I think we all have a role to play if we are concerned about what goes on in Palestine, for whatever reason. For whatever reason. I think the role of an activist from the inside is different from an activist in Ohio. And I think that's why I don't think that the BDS is doing the wrong thing there. I think they're doing the right thing. I'm much more worried by the fact that despite the very significant shift in public opinion in the United States, I can tell you that 20 years ago, nobody would have allowed me to talk in an American campus. Things have changed. Things have changed. But I'm worried by the fact that the shift in public opinion has no impact whatsoever on the ground. That's very worrying. I mean, if you think we have been so successful in galvanizing public opinion, solidarity, support, and yet on the ground there isn't one proof, not only it's not improving, it's deteriorating. It really is deteriorating. The question is it because we are not effective enough? I don't think that's the answer. Of course, everyone should do more. But I think the problems lie elsewhere. You know, we have a problem with the Palestinian united position. We don't have a united position. There is no Palestinian clear vision, clear united position. We're not getting to the politicians. And when we do get to the politician like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, they are at the late 70s. I have nothing against anyone. I'm reaching there as well, quite safely. But I think not every leader has to be above 76. We can have at least a 72-year-old leader who believes in Palestine. There's nothing wrong with that. We have a problem. We have a problem, but at least we know what the problem is. It's also something. Yeah.
Here, on the end.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pappè. My name is Martha Banks. I'm a retired psychologist, not currently affiliated with any university. I wanted to ask if you could go back to the question of the policing and the controlling, because we have a problem here in the United States that Israeli police forces are providing militarized training for the police forces in this country with an obviously racist agenda. And it looks like there is an attempt to control marginalized populations in this country, and there is currently a lot of political support for that. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about ways that we can cut back on that and how that might reduce racism in this country and raise the expectation of people in this country that they should not be supporting racists in other countries.
I think that as someone who's been active in trying to gain support in the United States for so many years, I remember a lot of frustrating meetings with African Americans in the past. It was very difficult to get through either religious ideas about the chosen people of Israel, trying to say to them, no, come on, the Jews in Israel are not the slaves of the United States. The fact that nobody could deny that there was a great Jewish support for the civil rights movement, and therefore there was a kind of conflation of Israel and the human rights. And I think that one important thing has happened recently is there is a clearer vision, I think, and more activist in the African American community about the kind of connection that you're talking about. And I think the events in Ferguson in particular exposed that kind of connection. So I think that this is a very important avenue to walk together. The securitization that Israel exports, it's the main export of Israel is security advice to how to quell demonstrations. They have an amazing industry of weapons that can do a lot of harm to citizens. And the reason they're so good at it, because they're doing it on a daily basis in the occupied territories. That's why people in the police departments in the United States would like to buy their weapons. I don't know if you've seen, there was an amazing documentary called The Laboratory by a guy called Feldman, who interviews the people in Israel who are the captains of the military and technological industry. And they say that sales of weapons, especially those that can deal with civil disobedience, is always on the rise after attacks on Gaza. That there is a connection between Israeli military operation and the success of selling these weapons. So I think it's a very important connection. I think also we should reach to the Native American community. People already mentioned that connection. And also to the Latin American community. I think Palestinians were to blame for not reaching to these communities for different reasons. Some of them were even racist, I would say, unfortunately. But they are now reaching these communities, which is good. And I think the communities themselves were not sure whether Israel is an enemy or whether Israel represents the Jews, who is another community that was suffered from racism and marginalization. I think the picture is much clearer now. And I'm very optimistic about these kind of solutions. I will just give you one short example. I know we are running on time, but just a short example. Part of our success in American universities was to teach, and it was a long struggle. We insisted that in American universities, when you teach Palestine, you should teach it within the studies of colonialism, ethnic cleansing, even genocide studies. And this was refused, of course, by many people. And in the University of Berkeley, one lecturer said, "I'm teaching Palestine as settler colonialism." And there was a big cry of the Jewish community and the Jewish activists and Israeli activists on the campus. And they almost succeeded in convincing the department not to allow this course to take place. But then the Latin American community of students was galvanized. Now, you don't want the Latin American community of students in Berkeley to be against you. And the university understood it, and lo and behold, this course is now 3 years being taught. Nobody's coming out and anti-Semitic out of it. Nobody goes and burns the Israeli flag. People are just much better informed about the situation in Palestine. So I think, yes, I was very encouraged by this new connection. Of course, Jesse Jackson and others, we were not alone. There were people in the community. But you know, even Martin Luther King, who we all admire, found it very difficult to say something critical about Israel. It was very difficult for him to do that. So we had a heritage here to deal with, which I think we are now dealing with it, finally. Thank you.
Question in the back there.
Hello, I'm Alex Memberg. I'm a student here. And I was just wondering, given like the sheer atrocity, as you stated, of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, but ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Israel, how is BDS enough even? How can we merely limit it to boycotting, divestment, and sanctions when this is, as you said, a crime against humanity, past and ongoing?
I tell you, the reason that it's effective and there is not at this moment that you here can do more is because you have to remember what you are facing. A lot of people don't think that there is ethnic cleansing in Palestine. A lot of people do not think that Israel is not the only democracy in the Middle East. So I think that before you can go on the rampage, so to speak, and do something more critical, you have to be confident that people read the situation as you do. Otherwise, they would say, you're insane. Why are you attacking the only democratic state in Israel? So I think actually if you are part of a university, you can judge from the way people change public perceptions in history how important are universities in this. They are sort of the first place where you change the way knowledge is produced about a certain reality. Then you move to the mainstream media. And believe me, the politicians would be the last people to accept a different perception. It's not in their nature to accept different perceptions of anything. They stick to what they know, and they don't like to know something new. It troubles them. It can endanger their election. And therefore, it's not just, I'm not convinced that what is needed is a more radical action. What I'm convinced what is needed is a far more deep kind of work with the politicians, with the mainstream media now, and not kind of a sense that let's give up on them, you know. Listen, I remember I was in Washington with Noam Chomsky, and there were two members of the House of Representatives who were willing to meet us. But they only were willing to meet us in this tunnel that connects the two houses. So, I mean, we need to get these people out of the tunnel and say, come on, nothing's going to happen to you. Let's meet in the coffee house above the tunnel. This is a very important mission, which is possible. And I also want to remind you as an historian, with something very important that people forget. The American position towards the Palestine question until the assassination of President Kennedy was actually quite good compared to Britain and France and even the Soviet Union, surprisingly. So even historically, America used to have a different position on Palestine. So we don't have to take this defeatist point of view that American policy will always be the same. It's a complex reality in which we can probably work more effectively and better. Okay.
One final question.
Thank you. I'm Eric Resnick. I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Peace, and we're very proud to have you here. And you are a truth teller. And well, I'm going to talk about that because, you know, even in the Cleveland Jewish News right now, there's a horrible, untrue op-ed about you that is just reprehensible. And, you know, this is the Jewish High Holy Day season, and, you know, they should be ashamed. And they're actually here today, which is one of the reasons why I said that. Okay. Because, you know, as you have said, one of our problems is to, you know, is to get past the Zionist lies and the narrative, which there is a huge enterprise with lots of money, about $3.7 billion a year, supporting. My question to you is, to Israelis on the ground, not the elite, but to Israelis on the ground, is there awareness of how big the Hasbara machine and the lie machine is in the United States? And if so, what is their perception of it?
Thank you. Well, for most Israeli Jews, Hasbara is not propaganda. It's a truthful reflection of the reality. So if you don't mind, I will tweak your question. Can we change the Israeli Jewish perceptions on the ground? And because this is the final question, I will tell you a story. And I think that shows you why I'm a relentless optimist, contrary to, there's no logic of being optimist about Israel and Palestine. And my children say, what can we do? We've taken him to the doctor so many times and he's still an optimist, this idiot. What can you do? I'll tell you, in 2000, I moved from Haifa to a small Jewish community half the way between Haifa and Nazareth. And in the local newspaper, there was an article, beware, Ilan Pappè has come to the community, close the doors, don't let your daughters out, and so on, because he's in town, right? And my wife, who's far more clever than I am, said, I know what you're going to do. You're going to write an angry letter to this newspaper, condemning them, cursing them. And I said, yes, of course, what else? And I said, no, we're going to publish a small ad in the local newspaper that people are invited to our house to meet you and hear your views at first hand rather than through the filter of this newspaper. And let's see what happens. And lo and behold, 50 people showed in our living room, and they stayed with us for 2 years. Every week they came to the house, and I started from scratch. I started from saying, I know what you know, and I know what I know. And I'm going to produce documents, and I'm going to produce my reasoning, and I'm going to do a home university with you. You are entitled to leave whenever you want. I'm not charging anything. But you are my guest. That's the only thing. You are my guest in my house, so you cannot curse me. I probably can curse you because I'm the host. But apart from it, you have to stay. And they stayed, and some of them left. But quite a few of them had a very different perspective on reality. So one of my sons, who's very good in mathematics, said to me, I understand why you're optimistic. I calculated, he said. It took you 2 years to change the mind of 50 Israelis. All you need is 550 years, and the Israelis would have a different view. Thank you.